Okay, so we are 2 minutes past. Still a lot of people coming in, but I think we should begin the webinar. So warmly welcome to this webinar. We've had almost 1,000 people signing up, so it's clearly a high interest for the topic. The topic of today is about the recently closed public consultation for the proposal for a universal PFAS restriction. And you will get a brief overview, first about ChemSec and then about the proposal and the consultation. And then we're very glad to have Hélène Duguy from Client Earth with us, who will present the more legal perspectives of the PFAS restriction. And then we also have Jonatan Kleimark, my colleague, who will give the takeaways or the main points in ChemSec's reply to the consultation on the restriction. We also have some time for questions in the end. The webinar will be 45 minutes. So please, meanwhile we are speaking, just post your questions using the Q&A function here in Zoom. And I will post the questions to Jonatan and Hélène as we come to the end. Yeah, I think we can, and also a recording will be available on the ChemSec webpage, and the slides will be available as well. All of you who signed up for the webinar will also get an email with a link to this afterwards. And there will always be also be links to the reply to the public consultation from Client Earth and also from us. Yes, thank you, Jonatan. Just to give you a brief introduction about ChemSec, who are hosting this webinar. We are an environmental organization based in Sweden, and we work on the issue of hazardous chemicals only. We are focusing on much on the EU regulation, where we are driving the policy agenda. We also work with companies globally and challenge them to improve their chemicals management. And as a part of this, we also provide a number of online tools for chemicals management to help companies moving towards safer alternatives. And we also have a work directed towards investors, where we inform them about the risks and opportunities in the chemical industry and related to the production of chemicals. We can take the next one. So the last few years, we, as probably many of you who listen in, has focused much of our work on PFAS, because here we have really seen an urgency, a big problem that is needed to tackle. And we also see a high interest among companies to move away from PFAS. And now, then recently, we also have these regulatory proposals coming up, both in the EU, but also all over the world. So there is really a momentum and an interest in moving away from PFAS chemicals to safer alternatives. So if you're interested in PFAS, you will find a lot of information on our webpage. We have different articles, news articles, and we have also had already a number of webinars related to PFAS and to the restriction proposal that you can watch afterwards. They are recorded. And then we have, as part of our work with companies, we have developed 3 different online tools that are also helpful in both the identification and the phase out of PFAS substances. We have the PFAS guide that we launched this spring, which will help you to understand if, why, and where you might have PFAS in your products. We have the SIN list that helps prioritize PFAS substances, and also the marketplace where you find safer alternatives to PFAS. And in a couple of weeks, we will give another webinar with more introduction into these tools and how they can be used. We also have ChemScore, which is our ranking of chemical producing companies, which is in turn used by financial investors. And there we have also had a special focus on PFAS and persistent chemicals in that ranking. And we have our Sharing Investors initiative, where investors are also asking chemical producers to end production of PFAS and persistent substances. We can go to the next slide. This is also our PFAS movement, which is over 100 companies that have signed up to supporting a broad restriction of PFAS, and that they are also themselves working on phasing out PFAS if they have not already done that. We can go to the next one. So the topic of today is the so-called universal PFAS restriction proposal in the European Union. And this is a proposal that 5 EU member states have worked on jointly and presented in February this year. And it's a restriction on the manufacturer, placing on the market and use of PFAS substances. And the scope is all substances that fulfill the OECD definition of being PFAS. So there is not really a list of substances in this case, but it's rather a definition. And so it's a really broad from that perspective. And the aim of that is also that you should not be able to switch from one PFAS to another just because it was not identified on a list. Outside of the scope, because it's covered by other regulations, is biocide, pharmaceuticals, and plant protection products. And there are also a number of derogations proposed for this restriction. And they are time limited, and there are 26 proposed and 20 so-called possible uses that have been proposed to be derogated then from this ban. And the derogations have been proposed based on the lack of alternatives, meaning that the ones that do not have a derogation for those uses, alternatives have been identified and also presented in the dossier. So we can take the next one. Yes, thank you. So there was a public consultation then on this proposal, and it ran until the 25th of September. So that's 2 weeks ago, I think, quite recently. And there was really a very high interest, one could say. It was a very large number of replies, 5,600, to compare with a recent restriction proposal, which also had a lot of interest in the media and so forth. They had 500. So that's really a large difference. And this statistics was published on ECHA's website just after the consultation closed. So I just copied that picture from them. But what's really striking here is that there is a really large proportion of answers from industry, so both from individual companies and also from industry organizations. Almost 70% comes from that part. And then we have this quite large part, which is individuals, and we can trace that back to a campaign run by the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, where they asked their members to support the restriction. So that's also nice to see. And then we have this little orange slice, 4% of the whole cake, so to say. And in that small 4%, we have academia, we have national authorities, and we have NGOs. So of these interest groups, which I think are actually very important, we all have about 1% or less of the replies. So I think it's important to understand the imbalance here also when the answers will be looked at later. Yeah, we can take the next one. So looking a little bit also where these replies came from, we have Sweden in top, which is again due to this Swedish Society for Nature Conservation and their engagement in getting people engaged in the consultation. And then we have Germany, which is not so surprising, big country and also much industry. A little bit more surprising maybe is that Japan is on the 3rd place with over 900 replies to the consultation. And we can take the next one. So what will happen now is that the scientific committees at ECHA, RAC and SEAC, Risk Assessment Committee and Socioeconomic Analysis Committee, will consider all these replies. Before the consultation, they specifically asked for relevant and evidence-based information. So that's the kind of information they will look into, and that will also be considered in the opinion making. And these committees will then produce an opinion, and it's supposed to be in place in 2024. And after this, it will be forwarded to the Commission, which will, together with the EU member states, take the final decision in the end. And then once this has happened, which has been said to, it could be in 2025, likely it will take longer time. But after the adoption, there will still be another 18 months before the restriction comes into force. So that was just a very short, brief overview, but now I'm very happy to hand over to Hélène, who will give more of a legal perspective on this proposal.
Thank you, Anna. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hélène Duguy. I'm a lawyer working for the organization Client Earth, who is also a charity, focusing more specifically on legal issues. And so I'm part of the chemicals team. I'm also a stakeholder observer at ECHA, so following the discussions at the RAC and CEAC committees, including on the PFAS restriction. So thanks again to ChemSec, who invited me today to present a legal perspective on the restriction. Just a quick note to say that most of what I'm going to present today is based on the REACH regulation, as well as on the dossier that was submitted by the 5 member states. And there is also a part that is coming, of course, from Client Earth, and that you can find more detail of in our comments that we submitted to the public consultation. Next slide, please, Jonatan. Thank you. So what I aim to do today is provide you with some basics on REACH restrictions for some of you who might not be familiar, and then explain a little bit where the PFAS restriction sits in all of this. So why it is justified, why is it an appropriate option, a word on uncertainties, and then a quick conclusion. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here we go with restriction. So the restriction is a chapter under REACH, is one of the several risk management options that EU authorities can implement to manage the risk associated with a group or a chemical. It's provided under an old title, actually from Article 68 to Article 73 of REACH. The main objective of this title is to address the unacceptable risk that is posed by some hazardous substances. It can be any condition for or prohibition of the manufacture, placing on the market, or use of chemicals, and that comes from one of the recitals of REACH. Next slide, please. So a word on process and the main components. So the process of a restriction starts with a proposal that can be made by either member states. In this case, we have 5 member states who presented the PFAS restriction, or ECHA. When they make a proposal, they have to show that 3 main conditions are fulfilled. There must be a risk posed by the chemical or group of chemicals to health and the environment. This risk must be inadequately controlled, and it must be shown that it needs to be addressed at an EU level. So there must be a transboundary pollution component that cannot be sufficiently addressed at member state level. And then starts the second stage. So as Anna explained, the RAC and the CEAC committees at ECHA, they are expert committees, independent experts who are meant to provide an opinion on the restriction proposal that will help the Commission at a later stage to take their decision. So their role and their mandate is very well explained in detail in Articles 70 and 71 of REACH, if you want to check. So the Risk Assessment Committee will provide an opinion on whether the restriction is appropriate from a risk perspective. And the CEAC, so the Socioeconomic Assessment Committee, will investigate or assess the socioeconomic impact, including the availability of alternatives, and they're the ones usually assessing the derogations to the ban. It is important to note that these committees act also on the basis of third-party contributions, and this is why the comments that were submitted to the public consultations were important and will be taken into account by the committees at this stage. Next slide, please. The final call, however, of all of this is in the hands of the Commission and the member states, but it's for the Commission to take the final decision based on Article 73 on 2 things. First, whether there is an unacceptable risk that needs to be addressed. I wanted here to highlight that unacceptable risk is distinct from the initial notion of risk inadequately controlled that I mentioned earlier from Article 69.4. Because it's not just about the risk aspect, but it's also about the societal impacts and the social factors. And this is something that the court as well explained in one of its recent court cases, if you want to check it out. The Commission must also show why the proposed restriction is the most appropriate. And here, to make that call, they take into account the socioeconomic impact of the restriction, including and usually mostly based on the analysis of alternatives. For that decision, it's important to note that the Commission has wide discretion, and there is long jurisprudence reminding that. Please, next slide, Jonatan. Thank you. So now that you have the basic context under REACH, interesting is to see how PFAS fits into all of it. So if you remember the 3 conditions that I presented earlier to justify basically that the restriction can be proposed, it actually works also for PFAS. So what is found in the dossier that was submitted by the 5 member states is that, first of all, PFAS pose a risk to the environment and health. And why is that so? Well, because they are highly persistent. And what persistency means is that there is a high likelihood of irreversible damage on environment and on health. And in a way, what the dossier shows is that this is sufficient to pose a risk. Just a word here to mention that persistence is enough per se, because you don't have to necessarily belong to be classified under CLP to pose a risk. So a case-by-case approach can be chosen by the dossier submitters and the scientific committees afterwards. And there is actually precedence from the risk assessment committee on that. For example, always mentioned the microplastics restriction, but also very recently PFAS in firefighting foams and PFHXA were also assessed through this approach. It has also been confirmed by the EU judges of the Court of Justice that it is okay to rely only on persistency to show that there is a risk triggering the need for a restriction at EU level. Beyond that, what we also find in the dossier, and as noted by several scientists, most PFAS are associated with health and environmental concerns throughout the life cycle. And that's why we want to basically act and not wait for the damage. So this is what the principle of prevention calls for. But even in the case of major uncertainties, they would need the authorities would need to apply the precautionary principle, which you might all know of, found in the treaties, but also underpinning the REACH regulation, which justifies basically restrictive measures, even if there are uncertainties on the magnitude and the existence of the risk. Next slide, please. Here, I just wanted to show that all PFAS are included in the scope of the restriction. So it's around 10,000 chemicals. And why is it so? Well, because actually we have other PFASs have already been targeted by regulation in the EU and at international level, but it has been shown to not be effective in reducing the risk. And that's why REACH offers the possibility to use grouping as an acceptable approach to basically restrict. I wanted to highlight here that it's not forbidden under REACH to use grouping. Actually, it's even recommended in the context of registration. It's mentioned in Annex 11. But also in the context of restriction, we have precedents, as already mentioned. The group approach actually through read across is known from industry and regulators, and it's an approach that is very much encouraged by the EU. We have the restrictions roadmap that is kind of also pushing towards that. Next slide, please. Regarding the 2 other conditions, so the dossier submitters showed that there is a risk, but they also show that the risk is not adequately controlled. So you might know this map from the Forever Pollution Project, which shows very clearly that there is environmental contamination across Europe with difficulties to implement cleanup and prevention. And we already have severe impact on health reported and more expected, with high costs, not only on industry, who needs to, of course, implement cleanup measures, but also on municipalities and communities. We already have several court cases in several states in order to get remedy for the victims. This risk also needs to be addressed at EU level because of the transboundary nature of the pollution and the fact that states are not providing the same types of responses. And of course, in this context, we need to ensure the same level of protection, and that's why an harmonized response is needed. And of course, the importance of ensuring level playing fields, including as regards imports, is justified here. Next slide, please. So the dossier shows that a restriction is justified legally. Why is it the most appropriate option? Because there are also other options possible in terms of risk management. Well, what the dossier shows is that it is actually the quickest way to reduce this uncontrolled pollution to an acceptable level. It is a measure that actually targets risk from different endpoints like manufacture, placing on the market, and use. So it would mean that also imports and exports would be included. It is a harmonized measures. But also the dossier shows that other measures are insufficiently protective, including REACH authorization, CLH, emissions controls at site, sectoral legislation. We need a protective approach. And this is what the court has been saying also many times, that for this type of uncontrolled pollution with many uncertainties, restrictions on placing on the market are often the most effective measure to achieve the primary objective of REACH, which is the protection of health and the environment. The dossier also shows that this restriction is practicable and monitorable in many ways. Substitution is already ongoing in many sectors of the industry. Authorities are experienced with enforcement of restrictions, and there is already a development of monitoring methods, analytical methods, and even the dossier provides for reporting requirements for some derogated uses, which would help for the enforcement of the restriction. Next slide, please. Finally, a word on the socioeconomic impact, which is usually the one raising controversies, because indeed what the Commission will have to do is at the end of the day a proportionality exercise to show that basically the restriction is necessary but not having a disproportionate burden on society. And that means looking at all disadvantages and advantages in a broad sense. And for that, it's important to refer back to the Annex 16 of REACH, which defines what is a socioeconomic impact, and this is very broad. But what REACH mentions, that's in particular, what is important is to look at the availability of alternatives. What the dossier shows in relation to that, and I think they are quite detailed in providing examples and costs and benefits for the impact part, they really show that the longer use and emissions continue, the greater the burden on society. And the court has already made some conclusions in those kinds of contexts, in similar contexts, showing that when there is a damage that is irreversible, it's not necessary to show basically a threshold for serious, as long as we know that there are serious impacts on the environment and health. So the fact that the damage is irreversible is sufficient in a way to show that there is already a disproportionate burden on society. And for this proportionality exercise, it's not enough to show that there is a financial burden on companies. There needs to be more. Economic impacts, wider economic impacts, societal impacts. So different aspects must be taken into account, but a financial burden on itself should not take precedence over health and environmental considerations. Derogations may be justified, especially, and as Anna mentioned, if there are no alternatives, or for example, if EU legislation is already covering those uses. But in any way, derogations must be interpreted narrowly. So this comes from also long-standing jurisprudence. And the burden of proof is for those requesting exemption. And it is high in the sense that they will need to justify why they think derogations are justified. Next slide, please. So a final word on how to handle uncertainties. As you know, uncertainties are inherent to scientific process, especially in the context of chemicals regulation, because we don't necessarily always know what impacts chemicals will have in the future. But uncertainties per se are no argument to delay action. It's very important to mention. There is also, the court has been reminding that REACH and any kind of legislation actually must be interpreted in a way that facilitates the realization of its main objective, here the environment and health protection. In case there are minor uncertainties, the prevention principle should guide the assessment. And in case of major uncertainties, it's the notion of precaution, which I already mentioned, but I just wanted to emphasize that it's underpinning REACH. And so uncertainties related to existence or magnitude of a risk are not sufficient to just not act. However, if the risk is hypothetical, then of course that might raise a doubt regarding the measures. But it seems that in the current context of PFAS, the risk is certainly not hypothetical. Next slide, please. So here a quick conclusion, just to remind what I said very briefly. So on the basics that I presented, restrictions are needed when chemicals put society at high risk. So you can find it under the title 8 of REACH. The restriction of PFAS is justified because of the uncontrolled and the large scale, basically, of the pollution. And that's why we can call it unacceptable in terms of risk. It is currently, and as assessed by the dossiers submitted, the most adequate measures in terms of effectiveness, enforceability, and proportionality. Derogations can be justified, and we will see that also as SEAC will show, depending on the availability of alternatives and impacts. Just to remind at the end that uncertainty should always serve a more protective and not less protective approach. So you can find our comments on our website and on ECHA websites. And of course, don't hesitate to ask questions here or later in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Hélène. I think it was very valuable to hear this because it's sometimes under talked about that we really have also a legal foundation to why we need restrictions and other measures to control chemicals. So I will give a very brief key messages, the 8 key messages we have from the ChemSec reply to the PFAS consultation. And I will go through them, and I will start with what Hélène already mentioned, the grouping. So PFAS chemicals need to be grouped together. And historically, PFAS has been the poster child of regrettable substitution, which means that since they are so many and very similar in both structure and properties, it means that it's very simple to move from one substance to another substance, which means that regulating them one by one will be an eternal struggle and will not be very effective. And the number of substances in the PFAS family is large, and the possibilities for making new substances are infinite, which means that the only effective way to regulate PFAS is as a group of substances. And I want to highlight here that fluoropolymers and F-gases are also members of the PFAS family. As mentioned in the dossier, the restriction aims at restricting the persistent PFAS. And both F-gases and fluoropolymers are part of that persistent family. If we look at the fluoropolymers, the life cycle of fluoropolymers is highly problematic. And there is a lot of references right now regarding whether fluoropolymers are considered to be polymers of low concern under some OECD criteria. And so I would like to address that already now. I've seen there is already questions about this in the Q&A. So there are no adopted OECD criteria for polymers, for what is a polymer of low concern. There's been a working group working with that topic within OECD, but there are no adopted criteria. And that working group has focused on the use phase of polymers, which means that it's a very inadequate assessment that's made because it excludes the production phase and it excludes the end of life phase, which means that using or referencing this is, I would say, scientifically not really fair because it's a very incomplete assessment. So therefore, it's not, you cannot say that the fluoropolymers are considered polymers of low concern because there are no OECD criteria for that. There are no definition. So it is definitely not something, a definition we can use for this specific setting. If we move to F-gases, over 60% of the emissions from PFAS comes from or derives from F-gases. And they are also a very large source of TFA, which is a PFAS molecule which is very abundant in water, in our different waters today. And regarding the F-gases, there are also plenty of alternatives already available and at scale and commercially available for many of the uses. So in conclusion, both fluoropolymers and F-gases are vital that we include in the PFAS restriction to make sure that we really restrict these persistent PFAS. The green transition can happen without or alongside a PFAS restriction. As we have shown, there's only a small part of PFAS uses that are attributed to critical uses for society, including the green transition uses. And for many of these uses, there are already alternatives available or under development. And the whole process and the whole sort of setup of a restriction is to give derogations for uses where there are no alternatives available, which means that will give time for the development of alternatives under the use of derogations. So there is a legal process for how to make sure that we find alternatives if there are none today. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that we cannot have a transition that can be called green if it contributes to the PFAS crisis that we are fighting today. And safer alternatives are already available for many uses. There are well-established alternatives that's available. Of course, this is not comprehensive, but I think it's important to point out that we have a wide array of different alternatives that we can apply already today. And what we see now is there is also a lot of innovation happening. We see that there is upcoming regulation, so there is a lot of focus on innovation and R&D to make sure that we fill these gaps where we don't have alternatives today. And for many companies that are already have developed these safe alternatives, this is a great business opportunity. And I think that's also important to point out, that we need to make sure that these companies that have been used the foresight and understanding and understood that they need to work on these already for many years, they should benefit from that. And the anticipation of regulation is the key driver to innovation. So we need the regulation to happen in order for all of this innovation effort to really pay off. But we already see companies that are taking action. And we also see a lot of companies and businesses that want to take action, that want to phase out these PFAS because of their properties, because of their hazardous profiles. And many companies already have already begun the substitution work and are identifying uses, finding alternatives, and doing the substitution. And of course, this is a way for many companies to future-proof the business. And this, starting doing that already now, as many companies already have, will be beneficial for these companies because they will be a step ahead of the competition. And again, in order to sort of support this innovation, this move, this transition, we need regulatory predictability because that ensures that we support these movers and these adopters. And just as an example, Anna showed the slide before, the PFAS movement, where we have over 100 companies clearly stating that they want to phase out PFAS and that they are supporting a group legislation on PFAS. But not only companies are taking action, we also see investors that are demanding change. As you know, there has been a wave of litigations against PFAS manufacturers, both especially in the US, but also here in EU. Of course, this is because the persistent chemicals is a big financial risk connected to these litigations. And in combination with them being a public health threat, the investors want to move away from PFAS or make sure that companies are moving away from PFAS. At ChemSec, we have the Investors Initiative on Hazardous Chemicals with over 50 investors with $11 trillion assets under management or assets under advice. And all of these investors communicate to the companies they are investing in that they want them to phase out PFAS and stay away from persistent chemicals. And here I've just a picture showing the active members of this investor initiative of hazardous chemicals. But of course, we also want to mention that we have, Anna talked about it, Hélène has talked about it, we have a global PFAS crisis. We saw the Forever Pollution project map from Hélène showing 17,000 contaminated sites within Europe, where PFAS is contaminated soil, water, earth. We have concentrations above safe levels in the blood of most humans, especially teenagers and infants. PFAS is omnipresent in food and water. We have already overstepped the planetary boundaries. I can go on and go on. We must face, or we must understand that we have a crisis that we need to face and do something about. The problem with PFAS is the persistency, and that in combination with the other hazard classifications that are connected to PFAS make sure that make sure that we have a crisis that we will not get rid of for many, many years. Rounding off my part of this with the price of PFAS, we see that PFAS has a range of health effects. It is extremely costly to remediate soil and water and make sure to remove the PFAS. And in total, all of these costs will end up on the society, that will be social costs that we as taxpayers or other will have to pay. And one estimation that we have done at ChemSec estimates this to be over $16 trillion annually, which is a huge cost. And comparing that to the revenue of the PFAS production companies, it is extremely large difference. And not only these are some of the costs, but there are other effects like negative impact on businesses. We see farmers where they cannot sell their livestock because of too high PFAS concentrations. We see fishermen that cannot sell the fish or shrimp because they also have too high PFAS concentrations. And we see all these adverse effects on biodiversity, where PFAS is found in polar bears and all over the world, which affects the biodiversity, which also will be a social cost that we have to pay for. So I think it's obvious that we need to take action on the PFAS issue. And I think that the only way to do that in an effective way is to turn off the tap, to make sure that we don't keep on adding PFAS to our nature. But on the positive side, we also see that there is a market transition that is happening. And the focus that we have and the focus that policymakers will have must be to support the front runners and innovators and the business opportunity that this poses, and to protect the laggards and business as usual, because that will have a negative effect on human health and environment, and also in the long run on the economy. So I think it's fairly obvious where we need to put the effort. And now I think it's time for Q&A, so I will leave to Anna.
Thank you very much, both Jonatan and Hélène, for great presentations. We are a little bit behind schedule, so I propose that we prolong the webinar 5 minutes until 10:02. So we will obviously not have time to reply to all the questions that have been submitted, but we will try to answer the ones that have been most asked, so to say. So there are quite a few questions coming in about the timeline. So I think I can ask both of you actually, what do you think about the timeline for the final proposal, and will it be delayed because of the huge amount of comments, or do you have any idea about that? Jonatan, you can go first.
Yeah, I can start. So according to the initial timeline, the ECHA work or the opinions from the scientific committees should come mid next year. I would assume that it will take longer time than that. I think we wrote on our timeline that end of 2024, we might see some kind of opinion from the scientific committees. I think that's a fair guess to do. Of course, all of these are so far guess. We are not really sure of the working plan for the scientific committees yet. And then taking it one step ahead with the committee or the commission, it is also, I think, very difficult to see how the timeline for that. Of course, as we see from the number of replies, there is a lot of interest. There is a lot of stakeholders that want to engage. So it will take longer time than expected, I think. But so I wouldn't guess on a year, but I think in 3 years' time, we might have a restriction on the table.
You want to add something there, Hélène, or do you agree? It's a guessing game a little bit, of course. Yes. So, Hélène, I would like to ask you another question. There has been a lot of talk about the REACH revision and the potential delay of that. Is there a connection between this and the PFAS restriction, or how would you say that they are related?
So thank you, Anna. Indeed, this is something that we've seen a lot in the media, and a little bit of a confusion on the two processes, which are independent from each other. So it's very important to clarify that. So the revision of REACH is on the table, but it's unclear when it will happen. But it doesn't affect the implementation of the current REACH text. And the PFAS restriction is a process that is undergoing in the context of this implementation of REACH. And it has all the tools to deal with the REACH restrictions. So whatever happened to the REACH revision, the REACH restriction of PFAS will go forward.
Thank you. And Jonatan, there are some questions about alternatives. Are there available alternatives for the restriction, unless for the derogations? And is there a mechanism in place to assure that those alternatives are safer? Would you like to expand a little bit on that?
Yes, so we can start with the availability of alternatives. I think that we can agree that for today, for some uses of PFAS, there are a lack of alternatives or a lack of suitable alternatives. And that's the reason, as we talked today, that we have derogations where we need innovation to find these solutions. Some of them will be challenging, but I think there is also quite plenty of time to do that development. I mean, if we're talking about timelines and 13.5 years, which is a longer version of the transition time, I mean, we see that means that the phase out will be around 2040. So there is plenty of time to do this development. I think that's also important to point out, that it is not a blanket ban that will happen overnight. There is plenty of time to find these alternatives. And regarding whether they are safer or not, I mean, there is, of course, this is always a challenge when we're trying to phase out and find alternatives. It's always a challenge to find alternatives. I think for the PFAS restriction, when we are trying, when the restriction will cover the whole family of PFAS, at least we will have made sure that we're not doing the same mistake again and using the PFAS family as a sort of a way to substitute. So we're a bit ahead, but I think this is always a challenge, and I think that there are ways to do that. There are frameworks for doing alternative assessment, and I think we have more knowledge now regarding especially persistence, that's a property that we should try to stay away from. So I think that we have the tools to make sure that we find alternatives that are, I would say, safer than the PFAS ones.
Thank you very much. Hélène, I would like to ask you a combined question. There has been some questions about the RAC and SEAC opinion. If you could just explain very shortly what would be the difference between these different committees, what kind of opinions they will provide. And then there's also the question whether the Commission can diverge from these opinions in the end and sort of change the outcome. So if you would like to talk a little bit about that, would be nice.
Yes, sure. So RAC and SEAC, they are independent committees of experts, and their role is really an advisory role, in the sense where they really provide an opinion on the dossier. So on whether the justification provided, the risk assessment on one side, and the analysis of the different options and the socioeconomic impacts are on the first hand are in conformity with the text, but are also credible. And so that's basically what RAC and SEAC do, also taking into account third-party comments. However, they're not supposed to add to the dossier or to narrow down or increase the scope. They're really supposed to give an opinion on what's there. Based on that, of course, the Commission has the possibility to diverge either from the dossier or the opinions, and that's what Article 73 provides for. However, they will always have to state reasons in case they really diverge from those opinions, and that's basically based on the principle of good administration. They have to give reasons and to explain why they did that. They oftentimes don't do it because they, of course, want to have scientific justification for their decisions, but they have the possibility to do it.
Thank you very much. And then there is a question I think that both of you can talk a little bit about. It's not one question, it's a lot of questions about the derogations and what they are based on. And if there is, it's possible to have time unlimited derogations. And there is also a question about how much you think the answers to the consultation would affect the scope of the derogations. So I think maybe Jonatan, if you start a little bit and you can fill in, Hélène, on that.
There was a lot of questions on the same time, but yes. I will try to see if I can answer to them. Regarding the process or how derogations are sort of identified, as I think Hélène mentioned, the important thing is the availability of alternatives and also the sort of strength of evidence we have regarding that. So the dossier submitters have estimated the potential for substitution. So if they find that there is a high potential for substitution for different uses or functions of PFAS, then there is no derogation. But if there is a low substitution potential or a low potential for substitution, there might be a derogation for that specific use. So that's the reason. And of course, they have gathered as much information as possible regarding that. There has been, before ECHA did their work, the dossier submitters also had called for evidences and stakeholders workshops in order to gather that information to be able to do a scientific analysis of the availability of alternatives and the strength of evidence for that. So that's how a derogation will sort of been identified. And then regarding what the public consultation, it's 5,600 replies. I have not yet read them all, so it's a bit unclear. I assume that there will be a lot of requests for derogations. ECHA has asked for scientifically based claims regarding derogations, so they need to find justification to add derogations. So I'm not. My guess would be that there will be more derogations after the work on the scientific committees, because there might be some uses and some functions where the dossier submitters have not been able to find the necessary information, for example. But it's also, I think, important to point out that 20 of the derogations are potential derogations, so stakeholders need to justify and to rationalize if that should be a derogation or not. So there is also that kind of information that's necessary to identify if it should be a derogation or not. So it is still, I would say, fairly uncertain what the number of derogations and the scope of that, but I think there will probably be changes made in the proposal during the opinion work, and maybe also during the remaining work after that.
Thank you. Hélène, do you want to add something to that, or do you have a different opinion on something up from this?
No, just to complement very quickly, REC and CEAC are not supposed to rewrite the restriction proposal. They are supposed to basically justify it and show where are the uncertainties, where are the difficulties. So in principle, CEAC is not supposed to consider derogations that were not considered in the initial dossier. And that's why the dossier submitters have actually different calls for evidence in the drafting process of the restriction proposal, exactly for that reason, because they have the time to investigate and to assess the different derogations, the analysis of alternative, which CEAC doesn't have the time to do. And it's also not their mandate. So I just want to manage expectations here, because it's not the role of CEAC to assess, from scratch, completely new derogations where there has been no assessment before by the dossier submitters, who are very competent authorities who've been working for years on this. However, there are already many derogations considered in the dossier, and for many of them, as you presented, Anna, they are potential. And the dossier submitters really emphasize that they would need more information on those. So I would encourage industry stakeholders concerned by those derogations to really focus on those. If they really think there is a justification for that, then that would certainly really help the work of the CEAC.
Thank you. That's a great answer, very clarifying. So we have come to the end of the webinar. We answered at least some of the questions. I hope you all enjoyed the webinar, and thank you so much for attending. We will put up the recording and the slides on the ChemSec webpage, and you will also get an email when this has been done. And please check out for our upcoming webinars on different related issues. You will also find a lot of information on our webpage about different things we have said about costs and so forth. So you can find quite a lot there. So thank you very much, and have a nice evening or morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.